The Victory Garden Vegetable Video with Bob Thomson and Jim Wilson.
Let's see now. Peppers and broccoli and onions and corn and fresh tomatoes. That's not a bad harvest, is it, Bob?
Jim, there's nothing quite like growing your own fresh vegetables.
And it's really not all that hard, is it?
You just have to pay attention to a few details.
And that's what the Victory Garden Vegetable Video is all about.
All the best of the Victory Garden tips and techniques.
And here's how to use the tape.
This home video contains 31 gardening subjects, arranged like chapters in a book. Each chapter is identified by an item number, which will appear in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. This will make it possible for you to know exactly where you are, minute by minute. Please note that a complete listing of the subjects and the corresponding item number is printed on the back of the box your cassette came in, as well as right here in the table of contents.
If you're planning to have a vegetable garden in your yard, the most important thing that you can do is select the proper site. And that site should be one that receives a full 6 hours of sun or more every day. It's easy to be fooled too, because sometimes you'd have some trees around in your yard that when they come out in leaf, well, they might cast a little more shade than you thought. So the evaluation should be made when you know where the shade pattern really is. The next step is to begin to prepare the garden. One thing is certain, if we're going to have a good first-year garden, we have to strip away the grass and sod. If we tried to turn it under with a spading fork or a rototiller, it simply wouldn't have time to break down this first year, and it would always be in our way when we were trying to rake and make furrows. I like to do that by using a spade, and a spade is a flat piece of heavy steel, sharpened, good sturdy wooden handle. And I keep a file with me in order to keep that edge nice and clean and sharp. In this garden, I'll begin the stripping process right up here at this corner. The next step is to move about a spade's width and come right down with another row. Now I'm ready to begin to remove the sod. And I begin by making a cut at this end and then take it out in sections. Notice when I remove the sod, I'm trying to leave as much of the soil behind as I can. Notice that I'm putting all of the sod in the wheelbarrow. Now I'll take that to another location and I'll let it rot down. It'll become the basis for a compost pile. Once that first strip of sod is removed, all the other strips come out in exactly the same way. Every so often I like to take the time to sharpen my spade. By doing that, it makes the tool work a lot easier. It also gives me a chance to catch my breath. Now that the garden is completely stripped, we're ready to do the next step, which is to turn it over. Now, we could use a rototiller to do this, but this is a small garden, and a spading fork will do a perfectly fine job. The trick is to be able to turn over the soil and break it up a bit. And when you run into a stone, you just move to the next location. The trick here is to try to deal with the soil in relatively small bites. This is a great time as you go through the garden to toss out any rocks or weeds or roots or debris of any kind. Well, not bad at all. I've seen lots worse sights than this. One big stone and almost a wheelbarrow full of other debris from this small garden. The next thing I want to do is to take a soil test. And I do this by starting off using a clean trowel and just a paper bag. And I'll take a core sample of soil from about 6 inches deep from 3 different locations. Now what I'm anxious to find out is what this soil needs. Is the soil too acid, or maybe it's too alkaline? Maybe it's deficient in nitrogen or phosphorus or potash. I can only tell that if I take a soil test. I'll let this dry out for a couple of days, then it'll be ready for testing.
When you've taken a sample of your garden soil to test for pH and for major nutrients, you can either send it away to your state agricultural college, or you can do it at home yourself with one of these simple, easy-to-use kits. You can test for pH level, for nitrogen, for phosphorus, and for potash. And it's so simple to use. All you do is take a pinch of soil, put it in a test tube, and shake it up with the proper solution, let it sit for a while, then you compare the color of that to a color chart. And from this, you can get a very good indication of what you're going to have to add to your garden soil to grow good vegetables.
A soil test will tell you what nutrients, if any, are needed in your soil. It will also tell you the relative pH of the soil. Soils west of the Mississippi tend to be alkaline or sweet. If that's the case, we use agricultural sulfur in order to bring the pH down to 6.5, which is the ideal range for growing most vegetables. In my case, my soil is east of the Mississippi, and these soils tend to be acid or sour. And my soil test report said I'd have to add ground limestone to bring the pH up to 6.5. This limestone is a valuable addition to the garden. It doesn't cost very much, but it helps to release nutrients that are locked up in the soil. That way we get better plant growth. The other thing this garden needs is organic material. And organic material, of course, helps to improve the texture of the soil, and it helps to increase its moisture-holding capabilities. I can get organic material from a number of sources: compost from my own compost pile, or cow manure from the local farmer, which is really great, or I can use peat moss. And peat moss, of course, is readily available, and they're both wonderful sources of organic material. What I want to do is spread about 2 inches thick of this organic material over the garden. Well, this cow manure and peat moss may seem a little pricey, but believe me, there's no cheaper way to get your garden off to a good start. Now that I've got this layer fairly evenly spread over the garden, the next thing I want to do is blend it into the soil. And I do this with my spading fork. I sort of pick it up and sort of sift it in. I'm not trying to bury it. I want it to be blended fairly well. Boy, look at that. I could grow anything in this soil. By adding the manure and the peat moss and turning it under, I've actually raised the level of the bed above the surrounding turf. And that gives me the beginnings of a raised bed. And raised beds, of course, can be made by putting strips of lumber down on either side, or railroad ties, or just as I'm doing here, I can go ahead and just slope the sides. That's all we need for a raised bed. Raised beds, of course, help us an awful lot to grow good crops because they warm up early in the spring, and of course they drain well. And if I make an aisle down through the middle, then I can go ahead and tend the bed from either side. Now that the beds are made, the next thing I want to do is add some hay or straw right along the pathway. I could use oat straw or salt marsh hay as I'm doing here, or I could use shredded wood bark. The purpose is that if it's raining, I can walk up and down the aisleways without getting all muddy. Well, I think this garden's ready to plant.
In this row, we're going to plant a couple of the vegetables that are well adapted to early spring planting. And the reason you can plant them this early is that they'll come up in cold soil and they will tolerate light frost. Now, we're going to plant garden peas and we're going to plant spinach. And when I plant garden peas, I like to open up a wide band like this. That gives me room to plant 2 rows. And the reason I like 2 rows of peas is I like a good thick stand, and 2 rows help to fill up the gaps that might occur in a single row. And before I plant, I spread lightly 5-10-10 fertilizer right down the middle of that furrow, and about 2 cups will do for this 20-foot row. There's one more thing I have to do before I plant the seeds, and that's scratch in that fertilizer, because I don't want the seeds in immediate contact with the fertilizer, or some of them might want to burn. And that gets us ready to plant the seeds. Notice that these pea seeds are soaking in water. We've had them in there for a couple of hours, and they've imbibed enough water so they're going to germinate better and faster. Now, when I sow in a wide band, I just spread them from side to side like that, and this good thick seeding guarantees that I'm going to get a good stand. Now, that 8 or 9 foot row should give me plenty of peas. Now, in the balance of this row, I'm going to plant spinach. And we don't soak spinach seeds because they're thin-skinned and really don't have any benefit from soaking. And in this wide planting like this, I'm going to get lots of seedlings coming up. And just as soon as the seedlings are large enough to eat, I'm going to start thinning them out, and I don't throw away the thinnings, I eat them. The rule of thumb when covering seeds is to cover them to about 3 times their depth. And with spinach seeds, it works very well just to cover them with your hands. Whereas with the pea seeds, I'm going to have to cover them about a whole inch deep, and that works faster if I pull and push the soil with a hoe. And I can't just leave it loose and fluffy. I have to pack it down with the back of the hoe. That compresses the soil just enough to restore that capillary action of moisture, bring it up from below, and sprout those seeds quickly. One final step in planting any seeds is to give them a good watering and to keep them moist until those seeds sprout. I like to use a watering can for the first watering because it doesn't run off like it might from a hose. Now, I'm going to keep that seed bed moist, and I expect that within a week or 10 days, depending on soil temperature, that pea seed and spinach will have come up strongly. The thing about starting your own vegetables from seeds is that you're not limited to the kinds of vegetables that you can find at a garden center. You control it. You can order just the varieties you want from seed catalogs, and you can have the plants ready when you want them. You can grow them at low cost, but most importantly, you have the satisfaction of watching those little seeds come up and grow into healthy seedlings. Now, when I start plants like peppers from seeds, I take a clean 4-inch pot, and I have a sterile seed starting medium. And the reason I want this special sterile medium is that it does not transmit diseases to the plants. And I don't get dirt off my pot either that would transmit diseases. So everything is clean to begin with. I take that pot, fill it right up to the brim with that soil-less mix, tamper down with the bottom of another clean pot, finish the settling by tamping. I pour out about a dozen seeds in my hand. That's plenty for a 4-inch pot. Scatter them around the top. Just take enough soil to hide those seeds. Tamp that down. Now, don't water from the top, because if I did, it might dislodge those seeds, push them all around. Instead, I'd take warm water in a saucer, set the pot in it, and the warm water moistens that peat moss in the mix a little faster, and it doesn't shock the seeds like ice-cold water would. And very shortly, that capillary action will bring that moisture up to the top, and the germination process will begin. I like to date and label varieties just as soon as I've planted them. I use a waterproof pen so it won't run. Now, two conditions that seeds need to come up quickly and surely is a good level of heat that's appropriate to the variety and a high level of humidity. They don't need strong sunlight at this point. So I slip that pot inside of a plastic bag and I secure it with a rubber band. And I put it in a place where I know I'm going to have a temperature of around 70 degrees, which is right for pepper seeds, and I watch them every day so that as soon as those little green seedlings start to come up, that I can move it to a place with sunlight. And that's all there is to it. How about that? Isn't that a beautiful pot of tomato seedlings, well grown, good color, but they finished the first stage of their growth, and now it's time to put them in a cell pack like this so that they can form a root system that will support them through transplanting to the garden. And the way we do that is we fill the cell pack with potting soil, tamp it down. Then we have to get the tomato seedlings out of this 4-inch pot. We tap them out this way. And this looks a little rough. We just smash them down like that a little, then we break them apart. See how easily these root systems come apart? Then you take an individual seedling, make a hole in that potting soil, and you can set them in a little deeper than they were in that seedling pot. Put in a little more soil, fill in around them. Now I'll finish the rest of that flat, and I'm certainly gonna label those so I can keep track of the variety. Now the best way to water these cell packs is to set them in a basin of warm water and let them water from the bottom up. If you tried to water these from the top, you might dislodge that soil and disturb the root system. Now the plants are well watered. They've soaked up all the water they can. I set them on a bench or a sunny windowsill and let them form a good, strong root system.
Leeks are a delicious vegetable. They're often hard to find at your local garden supply store. I started these indoors about 5 weeks ago. Now they're ready to set outside. They can take the cold days and even colder nights. I begin by digging a trench. A good tool for making this trench, which should be about 6 inches deep and 6 inches wide, is a garden spade. Next, some of our sifted compost. That'll really help the leeks to get off to a good start. I'll simply line the trench with about 1 inch of this compost. I mix the compost into the bottom of the trench. Then I add a little commercial fertilizer and work that in too. That'll help the leeks to get off to a terrific start. Now for the leeks themselves. I tap them gently out of the pot and drop them on the ground so I can separate the seedlings gently without doing any damage. I then pull them apart and set them in the trench the same depth they were growing in the pot. I space them at 6-inch intervals. And then as the leeks grow, of course, I'll be pulling the soil down from the sides, and that will allow the leeks to be covered, and I'll get elongated, wonderfully white leeks as we go on through the season. As with all plantings this time of the year, I like to help them along by giving them a drink with a water-soluble fertilizer. After about 3 months of good growing in your garden, this is the way your leeks should look. One of the most rewarding vegetables for the home garden. Onions are a great crop for the home garden, and they're heavy feeders. So I like to start off by scattering 5-10-5 fertilizer over the bed, and then scratch it in a little bit with a cultivator. And this sort of involves the fertilizer into the soil, gets it down a little closer to the root zone. And I'll begin by planting onion sets. These are small onions that you can buy by the pound at your local garden center. I'm going to set them in the row, a couple of inches apart, and just pressing them in so the tips just show. Now, as we go on through the season, 4 to 6 weeks from now, I'll be able to come back and harvest every other one as a scallion. Then I'll leave the rest in to reach full maturity. That's about all there is to growing onions.
I've just come from the house where I grew this flat of plants, and I know if I tried to set them in the garden right now, that they would perish from the cold or from the drying wind. So I like to use a cold frame, and I have this one covered right now, but open slightly to let the heat out. At night, I close it, and on extremely cold nights, I lay a blanket over it. Now, in this protected environment, these plants will slow down their rate of growth, and they will do what we call hardening off. And in about 4 or 5 days, they'll be nice and sturdy. We can set them in the garden, and they'll take beautifully. You're looking at healthy, well-hardened off seedlings of broccoli. Now, broccoli is one of those cold crops that can be planted in early spring. And cold crops include cabbage and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts and kale and kohlrabi. I'm planting these just a little bit deeper, a ½ inch deeper than they stood in the pot. And I'm going to put a collar around that broccoli plant, sink it about 1 inch in the ground to keep the cutworms from getting into it. About 18 inches apart gives me sufficient room for these plants to grow. They'll be spreading out, and in about 60 days they'll be ready to harvest. Now, I've got some space in between my broccoli plants. Rather than let that go to waste, I'm going to put lettuce in there, and that lettuce will fill in that space very nicely, and we'll pull it and eat it before the broccoli even knows it was there. Now, before I leave these plants, I'll move my tools and water with a fertilizer solution well balanced. It'll get these plants off to a good start, and in about 2 or 3 days, you'll have new growth coming on.
When planting parsnips, I want a big, long root on those parsnips. I want that root to think it's going to China. So what I do is I use a crowbar to make a hole so that there'll be nothing in the way that'll interfere with that root on its way down. And I really drive the crowbar into the ground and widen it up to make a hole like an ice cream cone. And I do this at 9-inch intervals. The next step is to fill the holes with this sifted compost. Or I could use just regular potting soil, much like I would use to start seedlings, inside. Now I press this down in, and in this stone-free environment, the parsnips will really develop beautifully. The last thing is, I just poke my finger in to show the center of the hole. When planting parsnips, it's important to use fresh seed every year because old seed might not germinate. And I like to place 3 or 4 seeds right in the center of the hole. And then I'll thin to 1 plant as they begin to grow. Now, another trick that we've learned is we know that parsnip seeds are slow germinators. It takes 2 or 3 weeks. Radishes, on the other hand, come up in a few days. So I put a couple of radish seeds right around with the parsnips and just cover them over. Then the radishes will germinate and I'll know where the parsnips are. That's about all there is to planting parsnips.
Boy, there's nothing like the taste of fresh, new potatoes. Now, some of the garden books will tell you that they're not worth planting in a small garden, but don't you believe it, because the taste is so much better than those that you buy from a grocery store. And you know, you can take these off, and if you plant right away, you still have time to plant a crop of lettuce or a quick crop of garden beans. Now, to plant potatoes, I use a square point hoe, and I make a furrow 8 inches wide and 8 inches deep. The next step is to spread some 5-10-5 fertilizer. And I like that formulation because it gives me good root formation. And then I take the 3-prong cultivator and work it into the soil slightly. Now for the seed potatoes. Now these are not just ordinary potatoes. These are certified seed potatoes. And they'll be disease-free, they'll come true to type, and they're sure to grow. I can get them from a garden center, or I can order them by mail. Now this is about the best size of seed potato, between the size of a golf ball and an egg. It's cost effective because if they were larger, I'd have to cut these tubers. And to plant them, I just put them about 8 inches apart in the bottom of the furrow. Now finally, I cover the seed potatoes with about 1 inch of soil. And I'm not filling them all the way in now because I want to come back at 2 or 3 times as these potato plants are growing and add a little more soil as they grow. And I tamp them down with a hoe. Now this soil is moist and I don't need to water them, but on a dry day I certainly would water them in, and those seed potatoes are going to be up and going in about 7 to 10 days. You know, there's certain vegetables that deeply resent transplanting. But on the other hand, they benefit from early starting indoors. And these vegetables include the melons and cucumbers and Chinese cabbage and even squash. And the way you go about doing that, and to fooling them into thinking they've never been transplanted, is to plant seeds in a peat pot. Just fill it up with potting soil, tamp it down like that. Take a couple of seeds to be on the safe side. Punch them down in there. Make sure they're covered well. Then you set that into a basin of warm water and let it soak up. Once those peat pots have soaked up all the water they can, set them up on a sunny windowsill, keep them watered, and they'll be ready for the garden in about 2 weeks.
The thing about melons and cukes, they love to have their feet warm. And one of the best ways to keep their roots nice and warm is to grow them under black plastic. And as I put my hand under the black plastic, even where it's a cloudy day, that soil temperature is quite a bit warmer than it is out here in the open air. And that's exactly what they like. And when I plant the melons or the cukes, I like to grow them in a peat pot to begin with, and then I take off the top of the peat pot so that it doesn't act as a wick and pull moisture out of the soil and away from the plant. And I just go ahead and use my trowel, make a hole, and set the plant in there, and it's just as snug as can be. And I'll give it a drink of water, and you'll see that when I water, the water will run right down and across the plastic, and enough of it goes in the hole to go ahead and give that plant a good drink. Now, this mulch also helps to conserve moisture and keep the weeds down, so it's a darn good way to grow these vining type crops.
Two things many gardeners do wrong when they're setting out tomato plants is to set them out too early and to crowd them. Either way, you're going to decrease production. Now, in this 12-foot bed, I've got room for only 4 plants, 3 feet apart. I'm going to set in 1 early tomato variety, 1 mid-season, and 2 late varieties, and that'll spread out my tomato harvest. These are beautiful little plants. I don't handle them by the stem, I handle them by the top. Keeps me from bruising the stem. Well-formed root system. Now, tomatoes are one of the few vegetables that you can set in deeply, deeper than they grew in the container. So I'm going to make a good deep hole. I know that the roots will form all along that buried stem. You can't do this with every kind of vegetable, just with tomatoes. Right into the bottom of those branches, firm it in around them. Now that's going to grow into a tall tomato plant. It's going to need support. And I've got a good sturdy 6-foot-high oak stake. Shove it in as far as it'll go. Needs a good firm footing. And then I'll pound it in with a mallet. And that ought to hold it. But before I leave that plant, I'm going to tie it on with twine. And the way to do that is to tie the twine first to the tomato stake. 1 knot. Then you make a double knot loosely around the tomato plant. And I say loosely because I don't want it to cut into that tomato vine as it grows. I'll come back later and add more twine loops as this tomato vine grows. Now another way to support tomatoes is to grow them inside of a cage. And this is a homemade cage made of steel reinforcing wire. This mesh is big enough for me to reach in and grab those tomatoes as they grow. Now look at the bottom of the cage. These prongs go right into the ground and support it. But you might, in windy areas, drive in a couple of stakes and tie the cage to it to keep it from blowing over during windstorms. Now the last step in planting tomatoes is to give them a good watering with a starter fertilizer, water soluble, to get them off to a good start. And that's all there is to planting tomatoes. With carrots, I like to plant them in a raised bed for good drainage. And even though I'd worked up this bed once before, I'm going to go through here again with my spading fork to make sure that all stones like this are removed, grass roots and other debris, because I want a perfectly fine seed bed there so that those roots will go down long and straight and smooth. Look at all that. I've got to take all that out of there. And my next step is to take the back of a rake, smooth this off a little, fill in all the low spots. Then I give it a fine combing. I want a perfectly level, smooth seed bed before I plant those tiny little carrot seeds. I like to wait a little while till the soil is warmed up because I know if I try to plant them in cold soil, they're not going to germinate well. And to make my furrow for planting carrot seeds, there's nothing quite as good as the V-shaped edge of a planting board. I just press it in the ground along that string, and it makes a beautiful, neat, soldier-straight furrow. I'm going to plant only a short row because I like to plant sequential crops of carrots to have fresh ones coming along. Now, to plant carrot seeds, I make a fold in the seed packet like that, and I tap it with my finger. And you see how that comes out nice and thin seeding rate. I don't want to seed them thickly because that's going to complicate the job of thinning and make me work a lot harder with this crop. And when I've seeded them very thinly like that, I don't cover them with garden soil. Instead, I take potting soil and put a shallow covering like this. Now what's going to happen here is that the seeds will come up quickly and they won't have to compete with weeds. If I covered them with garden soil, there'd be weeds in the garden soil and they would compete with the carrots. Now the last step, just water them in, start them sprouting, and they'll come up in about 2 weeks. And that's about all there is to planting carrots. When planting beets, it's very important to place them thinly in a furrow made with the edge of a planting board. I'm putting them about 1 inch apart. And the reason why is that these little corky things are not individual seeds. They're clusters of seeds, and each is capable of putting up 3 to 5 sprouts. So it's doubly important that you put these a good inch apart, or you're going to have a heck of a job thinning those things out as the season goes along. Now, when I cover beet seeds, I don't like to use garden soil. Instead, I like to use potting soil. You know, those beet seeds are going to come right up through there. They won't have to fight with the weeds, and no crust will form on them like when you would plant them in a clay soil. In about 10 days, those beet seeds are going to start coming up.
When I plant beans, I want to make sure the soil temperature is at least 55 degrees. If it was colder than that, there's a darn good chance those seeds would rot and I'd have to do it over again later on. And I'm planting pole beans here. Of course, they'll be climbing on a trellis, and all I need to make is just a single narrow furrow. And I'll be sowing the seeds at intervals of about 1 inch. And then as they begin to germinate, plants begin to grow, then I'll thin them to about 1 plant every 3 inches. Now, pole beans are a little extra work. We have to put up poles or a trellis, but I think they're worth it because pole beans will continue to bear all season long. Once sown, I cover the seeds with about 1.5 inches of soil and then tamp it in place with the back of my rake. And this tamping sort of presses the seed into the soil and helps it make contact with soil moisture. And then, as always, when we're sowing seeds, a drink of water helps to get them off to a good start. A nylon net like this is strong, and yet the strings are soft. They won't cut into the plants that are growing on it. And at the end of the season, it'll be easy to clean and store away after you've had your harvest. Let me show you how I plant my squash and pumpkins. The first thing I do is be patient. I wait until the weather warms up because I know if I plant when the weather's cold, they won't amount to anything. And the next thing I do is I put in about 1/2 bushel of compost right into the bed. And then I mix that with my spading fork into the hill, blend it in, and boy, that gives a terrific, rich mix. And squash and pumpkins are heavy feeders. So make a bit of a hill, level it off a little, and then I'll plant 6 pumpkin seeds in there. Space them about 3 inches apart. Now, I'll thin, ultimately, to 3 plants. I just press these in, sprinkle a little soil over them, firm them in place. Now I'll give them a drink of water. They'll be up in about 7 days, and this fall, I'll have a terrific crop.
Well, the weather is warm and the soil is warm, and it's time to plant corn. Now, I put in a little work on this plot, dug in fertilizer, and added lime to bring it up to about pH 6. Now, I'm going to plant this corn in a block of 4 rows, and the reason for that is that corn is wind pollinated. If I planted it in a single row and the wind came in from the side, it would blow the pollen off to the side and I wouldn't get any set of kernels. But planted in a block like this, no matter which direction that wind blows from, it's going to distribute that pollen evenly, and I'll get a beautiful set of well-filled ears. Now, I like to have rows of sweet corn about 18 inches apart. I know that's planting closely, but if you have a good fertile soil, it would accommodate planting that thickly. Now, with the first planting of the year, you don't make that seed furrow very deep. 2 inches is enough, and then you cover the seeds only about 1 inch deep. Now, you have a choice. When you buy seed corn, you have a choice of the plain, untreated seeds, like that, or you can order the treated seeds, which have a fungicide on them. And that will keep the seeds from rotting in that cold soil, which is a pretty stressful situation for corn. My only recommendation would be that when you're through planting is to wash your hands, because this is a poisonous fungicide. Now, I want to end up with about a plant every 9 inches, but you notice I'm putting 2 kernels at each place where I want 1 stalk. Now, perhaps some of that corn will not come up, But if I get 2 stalks at each place, all I'll do is just thin them out. The next thing I do is to cover the seeds in the row with about 1 inch of soil. Now, these 4 rows, all of one variety, are going to mature all at once, so you better think ahead and decide just how many ears of corn your family can eat. Now, after I've covered that soil, about 1 inch deep, then I tamp it down like this to establish the contact between the soil moisture and the seeds, so it should come up in just about a week. Now, the last thing I do, just to be on the safe side, is to give it a shot of water, thorough soaking, to make sure that corn seed comes up. Well, how about that stand of sweet corn? Every kernel came up just like it was supposed to. But I tell you, if you want a good crop of sweet corn, you're going to have to feed it when it's right about this size. Now, to feed sweet corn, I like to put my fertilizer in a band, a dry granular fertilizer, a high nitrogen analysis like 10-10-10, because corn's a heavy feeder. And why do I put it in a little band like that? It gives a good, efficient utilization of that fertilizer. Now, you can put it fairly heavily in the bottom of that furrow, because that corn's going to need all of that to take it through to maturity and get a good set of ears. When you're through applying the fertilizer, close that furrow. Now, you won't get any visible effect from this for about a week. You won't get any burning either. But in about a week, you better stand back, because that corn is really going to start growing. One of the most difficult jobs a gardener has to do in the spring is to bring himself to remove the surplus seedlings of plants like these radishes. And these are planted from fine seeds, and inevitably you're going to get more plants growing in a given area than will grow together comfortably. Now, if you have them too close together, too thick, the roots are going to be malformed. So what you do is go in and select the fine, strong seedlings like that one, and you pull out the surplus. And you protect that one like that, pull out all these in between, and I see another big strong one right here. I'm going to pull out all the other ones around it. Now, I like to thin on a day right after a rain, because these surplus seedlings come out without harming the ones that you want to keep. Now, that may seem a little far apart, about 1 inch, but they're going to grow very well, and you'll get good big roots with that spacing. Now, with lettuce, the thinning has to be a little bit rougher, because the initial thinning should be about 3 inches apart. So you have to take out whole clumps of seedlings, which might be transplanted elsewhere in the garden. And you notice this is the big seedling here that I want to keep. I'm going to take out 3 inches on either side of that. I find another nice seedling 3 inches down the way here, protect it with my hand, pull out more. Now, I've still got some surplus seedlings here, so I can fine-tune a little, come back again, take out these surplus seedlings. So I've got a seedling here, and 3 inches away I have another one. About 3 weeks from now, I can come in and pull out some of these seedlings to leave 6 inches in between them, so that I'll have room to grow great big heads of lettuce. Here in the Victory Garden, weeds are not welcome, because we know that weeds act as hosts for insects and diseases, and they also rob the plants of nutrients and water, so we really never let them get a start. Now, there's a number of ways that you can cultivate to eliminate weeds, and we have an assortment of some of the hand weeders here. This is a cute little thing called a Cape Cod weeder, and with it you can reach in around plants, even when they're growing close together, to weed with that little 90-degree angle. And another variation is called a magic weeder. There's nothing really magic about it, because it's been around probably 100 years. It's just a 3-prong cultivator. And with it, you can move in and around your plants to scratch up that soil and destroy those little weed seedlings before they get a good start. Now, for the big jobs, we prefer something called an action hoe, and it's got a little bit of action like this. And it gives you a good long reach. It cuts the soil just underneath the surface and destroys the weed seedlings. Now with this tool and our others, even though this garden is about 2,500 square feet, we can do that job of weeding in just about 1 hour's time. Once a week is all we weed. Now, one thing more that you can do to keep down the weeds is to take a mulch like this, and this is nothing but lawn grass clippings that we spread out on the pavement to dry so that they won't ferment when we put them on. And we apply them in the walks and around the plants about 2 inches deep. And that conserves moisture and keeps down weeds. But there is one little precaution. If you used any herbicide at all on your lawn, don't use the clippings around your food plants. And that ought to do a good job of protecting that tomato plant from weed seedlings. One thing for certain, if you want to grow good garden vegetables, there'll be times you'll need to apply water. Now, I'm using an old-fashioned sprinkling can today because while applying water, I also wanted to put on some liquid fertilizer. Now, one figure you can remember when applying water to your vegetables is that on the average, vegetables need 1 inch of water a week. If it doesn't come from the heavens, you're going to have to put it on yourself one way or the other. Now, we use a primitive rain gauge here at Victory Garden, marked in inches. We set it out in the garden to tell us how much rain we're getting or how much water we're putting on through sprinklers. Now, if you want to apply a little water to a small area, you can use something like this device, which is a pistol grip hose-end sprayer. Now, we never use it without a water breaker on the end of it because we could blast plants right out of the ground with the force of the water. So what we do is use this, and it's called a rose. It's a water breaker that is screwed onto this threaded end to knock down the force of the water. Now, this little gadget combines the best of a lot of things. And this is a water wand that has a water breaker on the end of it. Now watch this. Isn't that a beautiful way to apply water? And even better, just by turning the water breaker on the end, I can adjust the force of the water coming out. It's got a water wand that lets me reach in between plants. It's got a reservoir for fertilizer. It's got a little trigger right there for controlling the water on and off. And best of all, a quick release. Now, if you live in an area where there are no restrictions on watering and you can apply water as you wish, you can use an impulse sprinkler like the one we've got going in the background, or a small, lightweight, precision oscillating sprinkler like this, or a great big, heavy-duty oscillating sprinkler.
Here in the Victory Garden, as we get to the end of the season, and there isn't time to plant another crop, we take advantage of that time to sow a crop of winter rye. The winter rye comes up and holds the soil in place, and then next spring when we turn it under, it enriches the soil. Begins by turning over the soil. The next step is to scatter a little commercial fertilizer. Here I'm using 10-10-10. This helps the winter rye to grow with more vigor. This annual ryegrass seed is quite inexpensive, especially when you consider the amount of improving it does to the soil. Now I'll just rake that in a little. Doesn't take much. All I want to do is get it out of the, keep it away from the birds. And then a drink of water.
And now a word about vegetable pests and plagues. You know, in home gardening, insect and disease control is the #1 problem. Now here's how we go about it at the Victory Garden. First of all, we don't allow any weeds because weeds harbor insects. We keep a healthy soil, and if we don't get rainfall, we apply 1 inch of water a week. We use the proper spacing for our plants, and we plant disease-resistant varieties. We harvest promptly, and we rotate crops. But most of all, we're willing to accept a certain degree of damage before we'll spray or dust. For example, if we had a little infestation of corn earworm, we wouldn't spray. We'd just cut out the occasional earworm with a penknife and we'd still have good ears of corn left. Or with Mexican bean beetle on our green beans. We don't mind a few holes in the leaves. We still have a good crop of bean pods. But now, if the insects or diseases get ahead of you, we recommend that you consult your local authority, consult your cooperative extension agent. But remember the old adage, don't let the pest bug you.
The sides of the cold frame are sloped. They're made by attaching two pieces of 2x8 pressure-treated lumber. The top piece is cut on the diagonal. Done carefully, you should be able to get both diagonals from one piece of 2x8 lumber 45.5 inches long. The front of the cold frame is a piece of 2x8, 48.5 inches long. The rear section is two pieces, the same length as the front, joined together by these 1x cleats. To make the cold frame portable, the four corners are joined together by screw eyes and 1/2-inch wooden dowels. The cover of the cold frame is made from 4 pieces of 2x4 lumber. The front and the back are cut square, 48.5 inches long. The sides are cut at a slight angle to match the slope of the diagonal on the side of the frame. I do that in the front. I do it again in the back. The 4 pieces that make up the cover are held together with nails or screws and are further reinforced with these angle braces. Next, the top is covered with galvanized wire fencing and is held in place with galvanized staples. Next, the wire is covered with plastic sheeting and is held in place with a wooden batten. A couple of loose pin hinges to secure the bottom to the top, and you've got yourself a cold frame that'll last you for a good many years.
How about that beautiful compost? Would you believe that in just 3 months that this bin converted a huge mass of refuse from the lawn and garden into this magical stuff that can energize garden soil? It's really not scientific. All you do is take whatever happens to be handy, like this green matter from the garden, throw it in the bin, dried leaves, maybe a little lawn clippings, so long as they're free from herbicides. And you need some limestone scattered over the top to sweeten the compost and keep it from being too acid. A little garden fertilizer. That's going to speed up the process. And a scattering of garden soil. That adds the bacteria that actually do the decomposing. And it sort of cases it in, it seals it in. Now I'm building it up in layers, and I'll add layers to that as the season goes on. Now, no meat, no bones, no grease, because it can draw rodents. Now remember, you have to water this down, and each time you add a new layer, you water it again. And as the final step, I cover it with plastic to keep in the heat and to keep the nutrients from leaching out. Now you too can have beautiful compost just like that. All you have to do is to follow those few simple instructions. We make our compost bins from pressure-treated 2x4s that are cut to about 4 feet square, and we cover them with dog wire. We take these side panels and attach them to the back panel, which is about 4 feet high and 8 feet long, with these carriage boats. Our two-bin composter holds a lot of weight, and to keep these wings from spreading, we spike on a bottom bar, end to end. Then we add a top bar and cut it diagonally, and it swings open for easy access. Cost about $75 in parts, and is a worthy weekend project, worth every cent of money you spend on it and every hour. To make yourself a planter board, you start with a 4-foot-long piece of 1x6 lumber, water-resistant such as this redwood, cypress, or cedar. And you set your saw at a 45-degree angle to bevel the edge. You put your board against the rip rail and feed her through. And you flip it over and bevel the other side. And there you have it. I want to cut notches at 6-inch intervals along the length of this board, so I've marked it off every 6 inches. And to cut it, I place the board upright against the crosscut guide and against the rip bar. I run it through this way, flip it over, and run it through again. I'm going to alternate large notches and small notches along the length of this board. So still maintaining my 45-degree angle on the saw, I'm going to cut a small notch here and at the other end of the board. Now, by reversing the rip fence and putting it on the left side of the blade, I can cut out the other side of the notches. And finally, a nice 3/8-inch hole to hang it up with. And there you have it. A planter board ready for many years of service. How about a strawberry, Bob?
Sure will, Jim.
Well, folks, that's it. That's the Victory Garden vegetable video.
I hope that all the tips and secrets that we've packed into this hour will help you and your garden get off to a great start. And good luck to you.
And good gardening.